with us is presenting on Vonvo.com regarding the BDS movement. And today we are going to be talking about standing up to BDS on campuses. I know at least half of you in the chat room. For those of you who don't know me, I am a community activist with Stand With Us here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I am certainly very, very happy to have three members of the Stand With Us team with me. For those of you who are not familiar with Stand With Us, I think probably everybody who's in the room is. Stand With Us is an Israel education organization founded in 2001, based in Los Angeles with chapters across the United States, in Canada, in Europe, Australia, and a very, very wonderfully staffed office in Israel. And our primary focus is telling Israel's side of the story and educating people about Israel and combating a lot of the lies and the misinformation that's out there. And I think that the BDS movement really itself encapsulates so many of the lies and misinformation that we deal with regard to Israel. I'm going to ask everyone else to introduce themselves briefly. Why don't we start with you, Brett?
Sure. I'm Brett Cohen. I'm Stand With Us' National Campus Director. I've been with Stand With Us now for over 6 years. And I basically started as a student activist when some really nasty anti-Israel stuff cropped up on my campus at Loyola University in Chicago. And I found Stand With Us, and I've been working with them ever since.
Great. Ken?
I'm Chen Mazig. I'm 24 years old. I'm from Israel, born and raised, and I started to work as Stand With Us Shaliach for the Pacific Northwest for a few months, and then I went back home, and I was so disturbed by the things that I saw that I spoke to Brett, and Brett graciously hired me to be the campus coordinator for the Pacific Northwest, where I work today.
Wonderful. And Max?
Hi, I'm Max Samarov. I'm the Senior Research Assistant at Stand With Us. I've been working with Stand With Us for a little bit over 2 years now. And I got involved mainly because most of my student activism happened as a senior in college, and I've learned a lot of lessons about how I thought we could be more effective, and I had no outlet for that since I graduated. So I went around looking for different pro-Israel organizations where I could try to apply the lessons I learned, and I came to Stand With Us at the end of that search.
Wonderful. For those of you who were viewing, a couple of small pieces of orientation here. Let's see, I got a comment here that, let's see, Barbara can't hear you, Max. Not quite sure why. I hear you quite well off that. Max Ringelheim, if you can maybe help solve that. The chat box at the bottom, any of you viewers can certainly go ahead and post questions or comments there. We'll spend the last part of the show, if there's good questions that have come up, and we can certainly have the panel discuss those. If you do run into problems in the room, you can exit and re-enter. I would recommend not trying to open other tabs or windows on your browser. Some computers, then you may freeze up the actual presentation here itself. And the last thing I'll point out in the upper right corner of your screen, there's a little small donations box for those of you who are so inclined to help support Stand With Us activities, efforts like this. There's a secure online donations that goes through a established third-party credit card processor, and we'd be delighted if any of you feel so motivated to do that. So let's talk about BDS, and Brett, you want to give a little history about how we got to where we are and what BDS is all about?
Sure. So you can't talk about BDS without first talking about the Arab boycott movement against Jews in coming to mandatory Palestine, starting all the way back to 1921. Actually, the prolific blogger Elder of Zion has documented this very clearly. I just dropped a link in the chat for anyone who's interested to go and look. But we have news articles going back all the way to 1921 talking about this Arab boycott of Jews long before there even was a Jewish state. This continued throughout the pre-state period of the British Mandate of Palestine, and it's been an official Arab policy, accounting for their rejection of the Peel Commission in 1937 and the UN Partition Plan in 1947. And then 20 years later, the infamous 3 no's, which are no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no peace with Israel after Israel was victorious in the Six-Day War in 1967. Essentially, the boycott is representative of Arab intransience, which we believe is the cause of the conflict and why it's been so prolonged. In 2001, this really changed from what was for 80 years simply an Arab boycott against Israel into a more internationalized conflict at a UN conference held in Durban, South Africa. Now, this conference was actually hijacked into an anti-Semitic hate fest. It was so over-the-top racist that the United States and most other Western countries pulled out of the conference. And basically there, Marxist and Islamist NGOs and representatives from some of the world's worst dictatorships declared that Israel was the cause of most global ills and inaugurated a plan to make Israel persona non grata on the international stage. I'm actually going to drop another link for you guys into the chat here, which is an article from the Jewish Federations from back in 2001, talking more about the Durban Conference in case you hadn't heard about that before. So from the Durban Conference sprang the BDS movement, and the BDS movement is committed to the denial of Jewish independence and self-determination through the destruction of Israel, a UN member state, by the way, which goes against the UN Charter to call for the destruction of a member state. And essentially they're calling for mass immigration of foreign-born Arabs, which would cause the dissolution of Jewish sovereignty in Israel. The BDS movement's leaders, Omar Barghouti and Ali Abunimah, are both one-state activists, and they are against a two-state solution and peaceful coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis. And just to really hammer the point here, the BDS movement is not preaching coexistence. They're preaching the victory of one side in this conflict over the other. And it's a very perverse inversion of human rights. Here's their main points, which you can find on their website. I'm going to read them off for you. Number one, ending the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. Now, is this asking, are they talking about territories from 1967 or 1948? And these territories are disputed and can only be resolved through direct negotiations between the two parties. So, that's very open-ended. The second is recognizing the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. I think that there's nothing wrong with this on its face, and Israel, like any other country, has integration issues with minorities, but it's sort of a fallacy here because Israeli Arabs do have full equal rights, and Israelis are conscious of the issues and trying to help work to integrate them, and this is basically a canard. And the third goal of the BDS movement, which I think is really the most vile and sinister here, is protecting and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. First of all, this is explicitly not stipulated in Resolution 194 and is essentially just another way of talking about the demographic destruction of Israel. First of all, UN Resolution 194 was issued by the General Assembly of the United Nations, which makes it a non-binding resolution. Second of all, it was accepted by Israel, but rejected by the Arab states. So they're essentially trying to hold Israel to an agreement that the other side rejected, which goes in line with the Arab history of rejection going back to the 1920s. And finally, who is a refugee? Palestinians have a different refugee status from every other refugee group in the world, where today there are probably roughly around 400,000 people who can actually claim refugee status if they fled mandatory Palestine in 1947, 1948. But they have a unique status where their descendants, we're now in the 5th generation, so their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are claiming refugee status to a place that they never set foot in. So the other issue here is there a real expectation to return to homes that haven't existed in 65 years? Now, the other main thing here where they're talking about UN Resolution 194 is that Resolution 194, when it talks about refugees, is completely contingent on peace, which is not being offered by the BDS movement. So moving on, there's three main types of BDS. The first is cultural boycotts, which is essentially targeting Israeli artists who are performing abroad. We've seen some very nasty situations where, for example, the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra is disrupted and their concerts are just completely disrupted and they're not able to perform. And on the other side, harassing international artists who are coming to Israel. We worked with Alicia Keys when she was in Israel a few months ago, and Alicia Keys was receiving death threats for the first time in her life from people who didn't want her to sing in Israel. The next type of boycotts are economic boycotts. These are targeting Israeli businesses like SodaStream, which was in the news a lot lately, and also threatening to boycott companies who do business in Israel. And if you take a cursory glance at the companies they're asking to boycott, these are major companies: Intel, HP, Coca-Cola, anything that has any business in Israel, they want you to boycott. And finally, which Max is going to speak about at length later, is boycotting Israeli academics and institutions and passing divestment initiatives on college campuses. This is sort of twofold, and I'm going to leave it to Max to get into the nitty-gritty on this. But what they all have in common is that their goal here is not actually to win. They're not, when you're going to a divestment initiative, when you're calling for a boycott, the BDS movement knows that they are not actually going to isolate Israel. Their goal is to demonize Israel and to make the word Israel synonymous with everything negative: apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, human rights violations. That's the real goal. The real goal is to brand Israel as an oppressor. They are holding Israel to a double standard that not only to other Middle Eastern countries, which are just bathing in blood tragically right now, but also to Western countries. I mean, just a few months ago, France committed actual ethnic cleansing by rounding up thousands of gypsies and deporting them out of the country. But you don't see any BDS motions against France for this horrendous human rights violation. And their ultimate goal, as I said before, is to delegitimize Israel in the public's eye to pave way for its eventual destruction, which is really their ultimate goal. They know that the public won't go for destroying Israel outright, so they're incrementally poisoning people's minds with lies about Israel so that the crowd will eventually cheer on Hamas and Hezbollah as they march towards Jerusalem. And by the way, these three things that I just outlined, the demonization of Israel, the association with everything negative on the earth, holding Israel to double standards, and delegitimizing Israel's right to exist, or what we call the 3Ds, which were invented by Natan Sharansky, the head of the Jewish Agency, as a way to gauge anti-Semitism, to see when you've crossed the line from legitimately criticizing Israel, and I think there's a lot of criticism to go around, to just being anti-Semitic and denying Jews' right to self-determination. So that's my piece for this right now, and I'm going to pass it over to one of my colleagues.
Great summary, Brett. Max, you want to go ahead and talk about what we've seen on campuses lately regarding BDS initiatives there?
Yeah, so just briefly on the history of BDS on campuses, Brett mentioned the Durban conference in South Africa, and actually the first divestment initiatives that we saw in the United States happened shortly after Durban. So like in 2001, 2002, there were activists at Berkeley, MIT, and Harvard who were trying to convince those universities to divest from Israel entirely. And those efforts failed because they were rightfully branded as anti-Semitic, including famously by the president of Harvard at the time, Lawrence Summers. Now, again, BDS reorganized itself in 2005 under the banner of a call by Palestinian NGOs to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. And campus efforts began anew after that. After 2005, so before 2005, they were trying to do very broad boycotts and divestments from any company that was in any way involved in Israel. After 2005, they made a tactical strategic shift towards what they call selective divestment, which means the removal of university investments from companies that do business in the West Bank or companies that are doing business with Israel's security forces. Now, this was purely strategic, not ideological. They didn't change from wanting to boycott all of Israel to just wanting to boycott settlements or something like that. It was pure strategy, came from the realization that the public was not ready to accept broad boycotts against Israel. And in their own instructional guides, which are available online, they call divestment a, quote, stepping stone towards a broad, comprehensive boycott of Israel. Now, divestment is the most often used tactic in a few cases. They've also attempted to boycott Israeli products that were being sold on campus, like Sabra hummus, but that's been much more rare, and I'm not even sure how effective that's ever been. The first notable campus divestment campaign in recent years happened at UC Berkeley in 2010. Last year is when it started to gain more momentum. So back in 2010, it maybe hit a couple of campuses, but last year it hit 10 or 11 in the United States. And so far this year, we've seen divestment fail at UC Riverside, SDSU, though that still seems to be a little bit ongoing, and most recently and notably UCLA. That was earlier this week. And we expect it to come to quite a few other campuses before the academic year is over. Now, what's important to understand is, Brett was talking about how the BDS movement's goal is the elimination of Israel, the violation of Jewish rights, but this is being sold to students on campus who are generally fairly uninformed on these issues as a human rights movement, a progressive movement, a movement for social justice. And that is, that is really how it spreads, because when they use this kind of rhetoric extremely effectively, and the average person doesn't really have a good reason to question it. And that's really one of the most sinister things about this is they're using the language of human rights and these values that we should all be upholding to promote an agenda that's the exact opposite. And that's part of why, I'm personally so passionate about fighting against this. Now, I think Brett touched on this. The real goal behind selective divestment on campuses has really nothing to do with finance or Israel's economy at this point. Not a single university board of trustees, as far as I know, has actually agreed to divest from Israel based on any resolution that came from the student government. So by introducing this legislation in student governments, BDS is what their goal is to create a forum to spread lies and turn public opinion against Israel, particularly the opinion of the future leaders of this country, who are often the ones sitting in student government making decisions, because they're self-selected leaders. You can assume that many of them take up leadership positions later on in life as well. So they want this forum to spread the most disgusting lies imaginable. I mean, I was at UCLA on Tuesday. We heard people saying that Israel is sterilizing Ethiopian women without their knowledge. We heard that Israel is deliberately shooting Palestinian children in the face. We heard that Israel practices eugenics, genocide. I mean, every manner of slanderous hate speech against Israel that you could possibly imagine you will hear at most divestment hearings. I mean, I've seen some that were more civil, but quite a number that I've watched or been at recently have devolved into that level of just hatred and ignorance. And so you have that sort of form, and divestment hopes that by doing enough of these kind of show trials in front of the future leaders of our country, it will erode public support for Israel, and ultimately 10, 20, whatever, 30 years down the line, this will lead to real economic pressure, real isolation, ultimately the real elimination of Israel as a Jewish state. Now, as far as, again, Brett touched on this as well, but I'm going to follow up. BDS sees just having this debate on campus as a positive, because it allows them to damage Israel's image. So their MO, regardless of whether they win or lose a vote, is to keep bringing it back every single year. They don't get discouraged because it got voted down at some university. They're just going to keep bringing it back because they're not about winning. They're just about creating that forum for lies and hate. And so ultimately, again, winning is not the primary goal, but for them, what winning a vote means, for example, is that it has a symbolic impact. they can use it to gain more attention for themselves in the media, which again, attention for them is a really important thing. And it helps them gain momentum towards divestment campaigns at other universities. So they're trying to kind of piggyback one after another to build and build and build to make this a national and international movement. For us, what winning a divestment vote means is it's basically, since BDS calls for Israel's elimination and the violation of Jewish rights to self-determination, winning the vote is a reaffirmation of Israel's right to exist, and as well as defend its men, women, and children from terrorism, because what divestment resolutions call for divestment from is often checkpoints, the barrier, things that are keeping Israelis alive every single day. And in some cases, though unfortunately not all, votes against divestment have also symbolized the rejection of misinformation that BDS promotes. That hasn't always been the case because our side has not always effectively enough combated the misinformation, and that's one of the aspects that we need to get better on. I'll throw it over to the next person now.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Max. And I think, one of the points that you brought up, it's very, very explicit that we've seen when they lose, they actually put out their statements on their social media and their groups. When we lose, we win, because their point is, again, bringing their misinformation out, having these, what are essentially, as you said, show trials, defaming Israel. Whether they actually win the vote is not necessarily as important as getting all of their lies out there. And, to me, it's kind of like when Hamas keeps shooting rockets off at Sderot or other towns. They'll fire 1,000 rockets off. If one of them hits, they win, but they still manage to cause a lot of problems, even when they don't end up actually hitting civilian areas. And unfortunately, I think BDS has adopted the same approach. Pam, you've been on a lot of these campuses when BDS efforts get discussed. Tell us a little bit about what the atmosphere is like at these events. What's it like on campus at that point?
I'll interject something. The first BDS resolution that was passed, although it's everyone think that it was Berkeley, it wasn't Berkeley. The first one was in Evergreen College, where almost 80% of the students in 2009 or 10 passed the resolution to boycott Israel. And Evergreen College is a college in Olympia, Washington. It's the college where Rachel Corrie, that was involved in an accident in the Gaza Strip, where she unfortunately died. She went into a war zone and she died. And she came out of this college, so they use her memory to promote this hate speech on college campuses, which I believe is wrong. The atmosphere on college campuses, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, we didn't saw any BDS effort in terms of the college in the student senate bodies, but we do see that they have BDS events and that they have events where the title is always BDS, Boycott from Israel, BDS 101, Occupation in Jerusalem, BDS, etc. And they're trying to get the term BDS to be something that people will talk about, people will use in the public, getting it into the public opinion. And the atmosphere is really bad. The atmosphere is really bad. It's always there's a lot of tension in the air. I participated in a BDS event in Portland, and some of the students that I worked with, Jewish students, were told to not get back into the room. Now it's a public event for students that is being sponsored by the university pays for it. And the BDS activists is basically push students out, saying that those students should not be there because they're anti-BDS, because they want to protect themselves. And as we mentioned before, there was the resolution of the presidents of the universities that say that they condemn the ASA for the BDS resolution. An important state, not only that the president condemned, it said it's going to, this resolution encouraged me to strengthen the connections with Israel universities. And just last week, important state university, the anti-Israel student group, along with the African Student Union, released a statement with activists from the African Students Union, not the African Students Union, saying that they condemn the president of the university for saying something like that. So even when we don't see them come into the student senate and bringing this resolution, we do see them trying to change the atmosphere, getting the people ready for something like that. It's important for them to build a public support in terms of the students in the colleges.
And if I could just jump in for a minute, I just dropped a article into the chat from Urbanite News, but it's basically about a hate crime that happened at University of Windsor this past week relating to BDS. Long story short, one of the student senators had his office broken into, and they spray painted Zionist on the wall and spray painted the Star of David under it. And what he said was that the referendum has caused significant controversy on campus with reports of violence and intimidation. Crawford alleged in an open address to students via his president's blog that one of his executives verbally threatened a student, and the incident was reported to campus police, that students on both sides of the issue have been facing and tearing down campus materials. He wrote, "When I started as a University of Windsor student, I never saw this kind of thing developing because I always thought we were safe and we are a safe and cohesive student body. But this year has just gotten worse and worse with the division." And this is something that we see on every campus that BDS has come, is that it essentially introduces the Middle East war into the campus dialogue and just creates an incredibly negative situation where you have the BDS side really out for blood, and you have the pro-Israel side just trying to stay afloat and convince everyone that we have a right to exist. And it's a very asymmetric conflict on campus because it's not like a war where two sides are trying to annihilate each other. You have here this asymmetric conflict where one side, the BDS side, is trying to annihilate the pro-Israel side, and the pro-Israel side just wants to live in peace and doesn't want to fight about this and wants to find a solution and wishes we could all just get along. So it's just a very asymmetric battle that's being waged on campus, and we see every campus that it's been on, the student population has become more and more divisive and more bitter.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing about that too, if I can. The BDS creates a completely divisive, atmosphere and campus climate, but how do BDS activists justify doing that? They're somewhat clever about this. They say that the movement against slavery was also divisive, that the movement against apartheid was also divisive, that there were racists who also opposed ending slavery, ending Jim Crow, ending apartheid, and for them, the movements against those things made them uncomfortable. So what they're trying to do is brand anyone who's a supporter of Israel or even just an opponent of divestment in BDS as a racist akin to someone who supports Jim Crow. So that's something really important to understand is you can't just go out there and say, this is divisive, this hurts me, because they're going to brand you as a racist. In the ilk of someone who would have supported Jim Crow, you have to clearly articulate what is so wrong about this. So specifically, they're making misleading accusations. They're calling for divestment from safety measures that keep people alive every single day. And they're trying to contribute to a movement that is actually calling for the violation of people's human rights, not the upholding of human rights. And so anytime you talk about divisiveness, marginalization, hurt feelings, anything like that, it has to be backed up very solidly about why, because otherwise you leave yourself completely open to being branded as, an Afrikaner or a white Southerner who was for slavery and whatnot.
Yeah, Max has this exactly right. And, Max, you, I think, were at the UCLA hearings this week. I've been at two of the Berkeley hearings, the one last year and then the one 4 years ago. And all of the BDS folks play from the same playbook. They use the same phrases. Exactly what you saw at UCLA is what I saw at Berkeley. And they very, very clearly set up an atmosphere of intimidation. When one of their speakers says something, I mean, these people are training themselves in the art of oratory. They are loud, they are strong, and then they have their cheering section that absolutely on cue will erupt in cheers. At Berkeley, they massed in the front of the room to try to intimidate other folks there. And, this is for college students on our side who are not necessarily trained for this. It's a very intimidating, it's a very scary atmosphere. Those of us who've been involved in pushing back against anti-Israel activists for years, we know what to expect, but the students on our side, unfortunately, are just not as experienced at this. So let's move on, because some people appropriately in the chat room are raising the questions, okay, well, what's the strategy? What do we do to respond to this? And I think that there's two general things you look at. One is, what do you do on campuses before one of these BDS resolutions is introduced, and what's the groundwork that you do? And then the second thing is, what actions do you take once one of these has been introduced to help fight it and counteract it? So let's look at these just one at a time. Max, if you want to start just talking about proactive things that students who are pro-Israel can be doing on campus before BDS actually rears its ugly head.
Yeah. So I can't stress enough that by far the best way to combat this movement is to be proactive. Even if BDS ends up coming to your campus, if you were proactive in advance to work to at least prepare yourself for it, prepare the groundwork for it, you will have such an easier time dealing with it if and when it comes. As far as what being proactive means, a big part of it is just being as effective as you can possibly be as a pro-Israel activist on campus, meaning educating as many people as possible, educating as many student leaders as possible, building as many relationships with student leaders as possible, especially, of course, since student governments are the ones making decisions about divestment, educating the leaders of their student government about the issues long before, because you have to realize that even if you don't see SJP on your campus doing things publicly, you should assume that they're talking to your student government members, they're building relationships with other groups on campus. That's all behind the scenes. You're not going to be able to see them do that for the most part. You should assume that's happening if you have an SJP on your campus, and you should be doing the same as much as possible.
I'd also like to add in here that we need to also look at what the other side is doing. Like in the past 2 years, Israel Apartheid Week has really tapered off as far as the street theater of apartheid walls and mock checkpoints and that sort of stuff has not been happening as much, because the SJP's student justice and Palestine groups have been concentrating their efforts on making alliances with other groups on campus and infiltrating student government and infiltrating student paper. But it's really important for us to analyze the rhetoric, because this has come up now a couple of times in the past few weeks, mostly from the wing-pat Jewish anti-Zionist left over at Mondoweiss. But there's this movement to corral anything that's supportive of Israel into this hardline right-wing category, which is quite frankly obscene. You have this coalition of radical leftists, anarchists and communists and Marxists working together with radical Muslims who basically are supporting the Hamas party line on campus. And they have nothing else in common values-wise. They have nothing in common, as far as the things that they believe in, except for being against Israel. And they want to malign everyone who supports Israel as right-wing. Where you get into this bizarre scenario where Hen and I, who are two gay progressives, are being maligned as ultra right-wing hawkish conservatives, which is just completely ridiculous and hilarious to us. But this is the situation that we're in, is that it's not just about framing it as a human rights issue and framing BDS as anti-racism and pro-human rights. It's about really maligning Israel with everything that could possibly be perceived as negative, going all the way from, like I said, talking before about genocide and ethnic cleansing, to calling us right-wing and these sorts of really stupid things that don't reflect the reality. And it's so funny because Israel is actually one of the most progressive countries on earth by any objective measure. So when they do that, it really just, just sort of gets my goat. But that's one of the things that we need to examine and attack, because it's going to put us on the defensive if we're not tackling the rhetoric head on and showing no, we're not right wing. We're not doing any of this. You're talking to someone here who's a religious fundamentalist, or someone here who's an anarchist, and they're going to call me right wing. Like, this is beyond the pale at this point.
But they learn exactly how to do it, to work with student groups. Like, when they put the apartheid wall, they work with Mecha, and they tell Mecha, this apartheid wall, Mecha is a Mexican student union. This apartheid wall is just like the apartheid wall in Mexico, so you need to oppose that. And they work with the black student union, and they tell them that what Israel is doing to the black people, this is exactly like, as Max said, it's Jim Crow. And then they go to the queer students union and they're telling them, look what they do to Palestinian queers, because this is all Israel's fault that Palestinian queers are being hanged in Gaza because Israel is collaborating with Hamas or something. I don't know, but they can make the points to turn the conversation into how it's Israel's fault, how Israel is exactly what you're fighting against, and Israel represents. So, and this is where I feel like our students need to focus on, trying to build the same relationship and educate their peers.
And one thing I want to point out, which I've seen recently, that's really one of the most disgusting things to me, is they're taking the words of people like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, people that were civil rights leaders and are now progressive icons. They're taking their words out of context and using them to support the BDS movement, despite the fact that, for instance, Nelson Mandela, MLK, and Cesar Chavez were all public supporters of Zionism and Israel's right to exist. So they're taking, people that people essentially, icons that people essentially worship, and using their words and legacies to promote something that they would have never supported. And so in that sense, they're abusing people and abusing their legacies after they've died. And that's something that especially people, in progressive organizations need to understand about BDS, and they need to understand that they're being misled and manipulated. And that's one of the most important aspects of fighting against this, is raising awareness about that.
Since we only have about 20 minutes left, can we move on to Q&A now?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, a lot of the Q&A does relate to questions of how do we effectively respond. I just want to know, before we just get to that, any specific additions that you want to say in terms of actually responding to a specific BDS resolution? Anything additional that the three of you would have to add in addition to what you've already said?
I think that the key is to not be afraid to use hard facts and to destroy the other side's arguments. A lot of the times, students will want to make a more emotional appeal, or they are not feeling confident that they can actually destroy what the other side is putting out there. But when you examine the facts and you bring in the UN resolutions and actually put them up and really hammer it home and have a consistent, repeated message, that's, I think, the best way to tackle it when you're in the, when you're in the courtroom and at the actual hearing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think consistency and repetition in your message is probably the thing that we have failed at more than anything in past divestment hearings, and something that SJP has overwhelmingly succeeded in. They have one message that this is divestment for human rights and justice. They repeat it over and over again. We are not nearly as on point and not nearly as consistent. That's something we desperately need to improve. One amendment I would make to what Brett said is we 100% need to focus very strongly on the facts of the situation and calling out misleading and false accusations. But I wouldn't sideline, for instance, making it personal. So if you're talking about something like, why divesting from checkpoints is wrong, let's say you have a friend in Israel who's protected every day because checkpoints and the barrier exist. Talk about that. Talk about how your friend, someone you know personally, or your family member, or just your people in Israel, their lives depend on this. So when these student governments are, have this resolution on the table, it's calling for divestment or condemnation of something that keeps people alive every day. How is that a step for human rights? It's not.
Right. But that's something that's totally factual and something that's not what I meant. Just to clarify, what I was talking about before was coming in with an argument, like we saw last spring. A lot of students made this argument, which is why they got trounced a bit. Is don't do BDS because it hurts my feelings as a student on campus, or it doesn't make me feel safe. I'm sorry, nobody cares. Like honestly, nobody really cares that it hurts your feelings. we live in this like very touchy-feely world where everyone thinks that their opinion matters and that people should care about hurting their feelings. But honestly, like, grow up about it. Like, that's not a legitimate argument to make. What
Yeah,
Max is
again,
saying,
slavery hurt. Ending slavery hurt the feelings of the slave masters too. So it's
right,
not
exactly, and exactly. So I meant it's like when you make an argument, of course it should be passionate and emotional, and you should use like your own real stuff, but it needs to be based in something realistic. So like what Max outlined was great. Also, talking about suicide bombing completely dropping off after the security barrier was erected. That's super important to get into, and you can talk. Like I know Chen has stories to tell about surviving suicide bombs, and that's something that you can bring to the table. So emotion is great, but just make sure it's used productively to further your argument rather than being used as a crutch because you don't have an argument.
No, absolutely, absolutely. We saw the same thing up here at Cal. Those kind of arguments don't work. Though again, in terms of the role of emotion, Elder of Zion points out, in his talks that absolutely emotions will trump facts every time, especially when the other side will openly and blatantly lie. We do feel an obligation to try to stick to actual facts, but the other side does not, and that's very, very important to recognize as well. Doron brought up a question in the chat room a little ways back that I definitely wanted to get to, and he was referring to the atmosphere on some campuses. UC Irvine, talking about what happened there a few years ago when there was the orchestrated disruption of Ambassador Oren's speech that actually resulted in charges leveled against the people who were involved in that. And now, he said what the people who were involved in orchestrating that protest are doing is touring other campuses, becoming career protesters, and said one of them was even involved in the disruption of the Israeli Soldier Stories event at his school, Cal Poly Pomona, last week. So basically he said, how do you expose these people and their lives without having adverse effects on the campuses and then deterring Jewish students, pro-Israel students who want to attend, especially schools that might have very small Jewish communities? I mean, that's a great question. I don't have a very easy answer to that. I'll throw it to any one of the three of you who wants to try to take a stab at that.
I mean, I had an event last week where I spoke at Florida International University, and the SJP were there. They got inside the room, and as soon as I saw them, I said, well, I see that there's people with different perspectives. Please stay in the room. Let's have a discussion. Free speech and the dialogue is the only way that we can achieve peace. And these are the sort of stories. I know that sometimes people consider the stories as, I don't know, shaking up, or that they can really hurt the campus atmosphere. No, it's a productive way. I can read you some not now, but we got some emails from presidents of Hillel, student presidents of Hillel, that had us in campuses that was very, the atmosphere was very bad in terms of Israel, and they thanked us so much for coming there. We're not coming with stories about how we kill suicide bombers, or how we do. It's stories that are promoting peace, that are promoting coexistence. And in this event, when the almost 10 SJP students got inside the room, they stood up in the middle of my presentation. They put tapes on their mouth and they held signs saying silence. And I said, well, I didn't put tape on your mouth. You are silencing yourself. The only way that we can actually move forward is dialogue. They kept on walking out of the room. At some point, I even told them, you know what, I'm stopping my presentation right now. You can come here on the stage and talk about whatever you want. Here's an opportunity to grill an Israeli, and I will shut up, I promise. They kept on walking, and the students that were there just loved it. In the end, I had one student from Amnesty International there, the bias organization against Israel. It's very, very biased. That came to me and told me I didn't know all this stuff, and as the head of Amnesty, I promised we will change the way that we are working. And she said, maybe next time that you're in Florida, Amnesty can host you for an event, which is great. But this is what we're doing with the Israeli soldier story. So, yeah,
and in response to Elgi's question below, which is tangential to this, about how do you deal with Israelis and Jews who are on the BDS side, I honestly think that it doesn't matter if you're Israeli or Jewish, or if you're Palestinian, or if you're just some random person who got roped up into this. It's all the same. The answer to hate speech is more speech. Challenge them to a debate. Bring our Israeli soldiers to come into debate, breaking the silence. 9 times out of 10, they will refuse to have a debate. The other side in this conflict is notorious for refusing to debate with Zionists. They call it anti-normalization, which is this Orwellian newspeak for basically like not engaging with anyone you don't agree with, or that you don't want people to live normal lives together. They go around attacking, and also to highlight what this means, like attacking anti-normalization, I think is one of the keys here, because it's what shows normal people on campus what this is really all about. Anti-normalization activists attack the Israeli Palestinian Youth Soccer League because they don't think that young Jewish and Arab kids should be having any contact with each other, which would deflate the conflict and make them live normal lives with each other as normal human beings. So when they start talking about anti-normalization, when they get into all this, use that against them, because a lot of the time these positions are so radical and so out of the realm of peaceful coexistence and ending conflict and all of these great values that we're trying to promote, that it's very easy to castigate them in front of the vast majority of people who really don't have an opinion on this or are just looking on and seeing what's going on. And I think that that's really the way, it's to turn their own rhetoric against them is the best way to do it, because it's faulty and it's really cheap, to be honest with you. And it's really easy to expose just how racist it is. Really, it's at the end of the day.
I just want to add one thing about dealing with like Jewish supporters of divestment and BDS. I'm 100% against trying to silence those people. They have the right to free speech, the right to voice their opinions, but what needs to be made perfectly clear on our side is that they are a tiny, tiny minority of our community, and they have no right to speak for the rest of us, and they have no right to speak for Jewish values, because oftentimes that's what they try to do. They try to kind of make themselves, put themselves above us morally, or make themselves holier than us in some way. The reality is, I've looked at polls. Supporters of BDS and divestment make up no more than 3 or 4% of the American Jewish public. So when BDS is putting Jews in the spotlight to justify calls for BDS and divestment, they're effectively tokenizing our community. And what needs to be understood, by everyone in the room or in any debate you're having about BDS is that just because a couple of Jews on their side say that BDS doesn't affect them negatively, doesn't impact them negatively, isn't an attack on them, that doesn't change anything up at the impact that it has on the rest of us. So, they can feel however they want about it, but it doesn't change how it impacts the rest of us, right? Just because they say it's not bigoted, just because they say it's not hateful, just because they say it's not anti-Semitic, it doesn't make it true. It's just the opinion of an extremist minority. And when you have a movement that's calling for the violation of Jewish rights, using a tiny minority of the Jewish community to take away rights from the rest of us, I think that can be accurately called tokenization and bigotry in itself.
I think that's a great word. Max, that's a really great word to use, because also, again, you have to realize that in most cases with the BDSers, aside from what may be a very, very small core of extreme right-wing hater types, you're really dealing with extreme leftists. And so words like that will really resonate with their audience. So I think that's a wonderful point that you just made there.
I'd just like to really briefly address Josh's question in the chat about he lives in a place with no Jewish community and hasn't heard about this issue and we're looking for outreach. Josh, send us an email at campus@StandWithUs.com if you'd like to get involved. Most of the time, it's very self-selecting, and we have students that contact us because they need help on campus. So if you'd like to educate your community, then absolutely send us an email. You can get us at campus@StandWithUs.com.
And then also, Ryan had a question. For those of you, by the way, who aren't familiar with Ryan Bellerose, and I have not had the pleasure, Ryan, of meeting you in person, but we've certainly, interacted online. He is up in Canada, a member of the Indigenous peoples there, very, very strongly pro-Israel, from the viewpoint of one Indigenous person talking about the rights of another Indigenous people, the Jews in our historic homeland. And Ryan's been doing tremendous work with the students up at the University of Calgary. So, it's a big shout out to him for all the tremendous work he's doing there. His question was regarding the role of grassroots groups like his and their effectiveness in helping to combat BDS efforts on campus.
Well, I'll say, I mean, we can't do it without you. I mean, you know, there is no combating BDS without, the grassroots, without people on the ground who are willing to stand up and fight. It's essential, and I think, it's really important to, as far as like being proactive, is building up a grassroots, a good solid grassroots group of people that are committed, that you can call upon when needed, to be active and to stand up against the hate speech.
Right. His question, he just clarified in the chat room, their role as far as building groups. And Ryan, maybe you can just type some additional info on that. But I think, as Max was saying, those of us who are, even the rest of the panel here, who clearly are, generation younger than me and recent graduates, we can't really come onto campuses and do that kind of work. This is work that we can advise students on. We can give our recommendations. They're the ones who are really out there talking to their peers. And, we can provide information, we can provide support, we can provide materials, but we're not the ones doing the work. The people who are on the ground at any of these campuses are the ones who are doing the hard work of building the coalitions, speaking out, researching, and fighting these resolutions if they actually come to a point of a campus debate. Let me ask you also comments. One of the things that's been pointed out about BDS, and we've all seen this, is what does a BDS event leave in its wake? What's the atmosphere on campus like after one of these? And I think all four of us have personally seen it, though some of the members of the audience may not have.
I mean, look, it's exactly as it is in the build-up. It's the explosion of this ridiculous conflict on campus, which leaves students bitter, which makes having a conductive learning environment next to impossible, and it creates levels of animosity that will only grow, because the only resolution to any of this is through reconciliation. And doing BDS is the opposite of reconciliation, and that's really the major issue that we're dealing with here.
And I think one of the more kind of maybe less tangible impacts is, like at UCLA, for instance, like you had all this abject hate speech, going out in the air, being cheered by a bunch of people in the crowd, being facilitated and politely listened to by, members of the student government. And, when hate speech like that becomes acceptable, I don't think you can measure the impact that has on Jewish and pro-Israel students to know that those things are allowed to be said on their campus without anybody really challenging it. Anybody who's like a responsible adult going up and saying, that's unacceptable. You crossed a line there. And what we see is just the limits being pushed further and further and further on what is acceptable in mainstream society to say about Israel. And that's one of the things that I'm personally most worried about. That's going to be my last kind of comment of the day. I got to take off to another event. But
thanks, Max. I'd like to respond to Alexis really quick in the chat, who said, how do you reach a pro-BDS Jewish person when you're not Jewish yourself? I think that reaching anyone who's pro-BDS who uses the same tactic, you have to get them to understand that their values and their beliefs are not aligning when it comes to this issue. That if you believe in a negotiated settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if you believe in coexistence, if you believe in recognizing two states for two peoples, if you believe in peace, then your belief of supporting BDS is in direct contradiction to your values. And it's the same thing. You can take any of their points from, they break it down into anything from, Israel is genocidal, Israel is an apartheid state. Deconstruct, show why it's not an apartheid state, reframe your message, and show them that at the end of the day, this belief that they have not only is fallacious and false, but it's directly against their own personal values, and that's how you make the breakthrough.
Great, Brett. Thank you very much. I feel after an hour, we were initially planning this event. It's like, oh, well, we're going to be able to, fill an hour with this. And I feel after an hour that we've barely touched the surface of this. And, we definitely are getting, really excellent questions from those of you in the audience. And I think in some cases, they don't really, have a simple, short answer. Doron's point about, how do you do this on a campus when there isn't a big Jewish or pro-Israel community? This is part of the challenge that we face. I think, as Brett pointed out, looking at the resources that are available, you can go to StandWithUs.com/campus. We've got a good organization that will try to help everybody out on campuses when it's something that we can help you out with. So, the resources are out there, but again, it's really going to be the local students who are on the ground that are primarily going to have to take the lead on this, because outsiders coming onto the campus just simply doesn't work as well. Brett and Hannah, I want to thank you very much. And, of course, Max had to go early. I want to talk a little bit about what we'll be doing next Sunday at the same time. We are going to have our second of 3 discussions regarding BDS. This one talking about BDS, fighting BDS in the community setting, standing up to BDS in the community, specifically when they target businesses, especially those that carry Israeli products like SodaStream, when they target what they see as soft targets like food co-ops. So one of our speakers, who is currently in our audience, is going to be Barbara Mazar, who helped lead the successful fight at the Park Slope Food Co-op in Brooklyn against a boycott Israel measure, and for good measure got herself on a segment on The Daily Show about this. Also joining us next week will be Rob Jacobs, who is the director of Stand With Us Northwest in Seattle, someone who Ken works very, very closely with up there. And also Roz Rothstein, the founder and executive director of Stand With Us, will also be one of our participants. So that will be next Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 noon Eastern. A reminder that apparently next Saturday night is the time when we change our clocks. So it will be 9 o'clock local time, corrected for the time change. So make sure you set your clocks on Saturday night for that. And I want to thank all of you for participating. I want to thank whoever went ahead and did a donation through the donations button. If any of the rest of you feel so inclined, we certainly are, thankful for the support that we get, in terms of financially. And, we're really happy for those of you who logged in, took a time out of your Sunday morning just to educate yourself a little bit more about this. Brett and Fran, any closing remarks you'd like to make?
I just like to have everyone to remind you to stay strong, to stick to the facts, and to call us for help, because we're here. We're ready to drop anything to come and help you.
And again, best way to go ahead and access that help?
You can send us an email at campus@standwithus.com, or you can find us through our website at standwithus.com/campus.
All right, great. Ken, any closing comments?
Hatred eats the soul of the hater, not of the one that is being hated. So remember that, and don't let them bring you down. Just keep up the fight.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Ken, enjoy APAC. Make good connections there. And I look forward to seeing all of you next Sunday morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.